Welsh culture of the slate industry. There were, of course, other perspectives. Round about this time, Mervyn Jones, Dr. Mervyn Jones, later Professor Mervyn Jones, later still Vice-Chancellor of Bangor University, was starting work on his PhD at Warwick University, in which he analysed the history of the slate industry very much in class terms, not in national terms, but in class terms, in a classic and very eloquent Marxist study. Now, just to be clear, that is, of course, Mervyn on the right, and that is, of course, Karl Marx on the left. So there was a lot of research, one way or another, going on at both popular and academic level into the slate industry. In addition to some of the quarries becoming tourist attractions as museum sites, some of them became focus for leisure activity. Now here's a fairly recent view of the Vivian quarry, part of the Dinorwig quarry. You can see the museum there in the background, which has become a very popular venue for climbers. Another development that also began in the very early 1970s is a series of annual digs under the auspices of the Snowdonia National Park into the archaeology, studying the archaeology of the slate industry. Now, these unfortunately had to be stopped this last year because of coronavirus, but it's been going for 50 years. Here's a fairly recent view of some of the stalwarts, myself included. I'm the chap on the left in the yellow hard hat, and we're digging up the remains of a winding house at Llechwedd Quarry in Blaenfestiniog. So there is a very great corpus of knowledge of this industry, and I'd have to say, when I started writing the book, I thought it'd be just a matter of putting together what was already known, you know, a few slate blocks, if you like, and a little bit of mortar around them, and the whole edifice would be complete. It didn't really work out like that, because when we consider what's left of this industry, well, of course, in the first place, it's had a very profound effect on the built heritage of much of the world. It's completely different in this respect from, say, a coal mine, where what a coal mine produces, of course, is turned into smoke. Now, I'd just like you to have a look at this painting of New York from the late 17th century, and you may wonder what possible relevance this is to what I'm talking about. Well, have a look at the houses on the waterfront there. You can see they've all got red tile roofs. Have a look at the church in the Dutch fort behind, and you can see that it's got a light blue roof. Now, interestingly, there are quite a number of maps and paintings of New Amsterdam, New York at this time, which are all absolutely consistent in this point. Red tile roofs on the houses, a blue roof on the church. Now, it's possible, of course, that that was a lead roof. We don't know, but it's blue rather than grey, and I just wonder if this is one of the earliest depictions we have of the export of Welsh slate worldwide, crossing an ocean. Now, quarries are unusual if they export over a wide distance. This is one of the things that the slate industry of North Wales has in common with Penmaenmawr. They had very wide distribution networks. This has got a lot to do with the nature of the material they were offering and the weight to value ratio. If you were producing, I don't know, big stone blocks, you can find a market for them for as long as it's profitable to transport them. But specialist products like roofing elements, or indeed stone sets, as you have at Penmaenmawr, were a different matter, and they're found all over the world. You can walk through a European city, you can look at the slate roofs and you can say quite confidently, well, that came from such and such a quarry in the Nantlle Valley, or that one seems to have come from Blaenau-Ffestiniog or Penrhyn or wherever it might be. Classic example, this is the Royal Exhibition Hall at Melbourne in Australia, designed as a showcase for products of the British Empire, 1880s. What does it have on that domed roof? But, of course, a roof of Penrhyn slate. Exports to Europe, most of them went through Hamburg, the port of Hamburg. And the port ledgers of Hamburg in the 19th century, they would print out the names of the ports that exported into Hamburg most commonly, and thereafter the clerk would have to enter the name of the port himself. Now, 10 port names were printed in the Hamburg ledgers. 10 out of 10 was Porthmadog. So a Porthmadog schooner loaded with slate would have been a very familiar sight indeed in Hamburg, and from there slates went on to be sold, put on roofs all over Central Europe. That market hasn't come to an end even now, of course. This is a photograph, a recent one, of the roof of Buda Castle, Budapest in Hungary, recently re-roofed with Penrhyn slate. Quite a lot of the output of the active quarries in the industry is, if you like, the carriage trade, the high end of the market. But equally, historically, of course, Welsh slate made possible the housing revolution of the Industrial Revolution. I'm afraid I forget where this photograph shows, but you can see very, very clearly here just how extensive these roofs of Welsh slate were on working class housing. I did a very rough calculation a year or two ago, which led me to the view that the entire output of the Welsh slate industry would probably have been equivalent to about 13 million terraced houses, assuming 2.5 to 3 tons of Welsh slate on the roof of each one, so 13 million terraced houses. So in that respect, I suggest it's quite an unusual industry. Its distribution patterns are global rather than regional or national. They are very wide indeed, and the archaeology remains. Now, in some other respects, it follows a common trajectory of the British Industrial Revolution, and this is perhaps where you can also compare it to Penmaenmawr and the stone quarries. If the Industrial Revolution is something we recognize as beginning in the late 18th century, well, this is what a slate quarry looked like in the late 18th century. This is Penrhyn Quarry in about 1798. No mechanization to speak of. The men are carrying the slates on their heads, in fact, head porterage, along these strange plank walkways. They've got their own tools, but lo and behold, within a few years, the quarries start getting mechanized. Here's a view of Penrhyn Quarry only about 9 years later, but it's already acquired some sort of admittedly rather crude railway system. 1832, this painting by Hawkins, which hangs in Penrhyn Castle, the undertaking has become an absolutely massive place indeed. All worked in these regular stepped galleries. It's not true to say that Penrhyn Slate Quarry invented this system, but it certainly was the first to apply it on an industrial scale in the context of the quarrying industry. And again, of course, it's something you can see in not only in slate, but you can see in stone quarries like Penmaenmawr, that was introduced at Penrhyn from about 1794 onwards. The men here are working at the rock with hand tools and black powder, but of course the process becomes a more technically sophisticated one. slate quarries start introducing power drills in the 1860s. It's a slow process. They weren't introduced at Penryn Quarry until 1911, which is when this photograph is taken. Reduction of the slate blocks when they'd been quarried, blown from the rock face by a gunpowder charge. And then the initial job that the quarrymen had to carry out was to reduce these big blocks to a manageable size, done for many years with this heavy oak hammer called the rhys. And this was, in a way, the most skilled and demanding job in the industry, because if you got that hammer blow wrong, your income for the week was severely lessened. Again, this is mechanized, increasingly from about 1802, but commonly from the middle of the 19th century, reduction of these blocks is carried out by a mechanical saw table. Now, one process is famous for never really having been successfully mechanized, and that is the actual splitting of the slate blocks. This wonderful view from the John Thomas collection in the National Library of Wales shows an elderly quarryman called John Williams, Rhyd y Gro, in the quarry in Penmaenmawr. And we'd wondered for years who he was. He's simply referred to in John Thomas's own notes, the photographer's own notes, as Lord Penmaenmawr. But about 20 years ago, I came across a local history essay, which had been kept in a chapel safe in Llandudno Junction, which described the Penmaenmawr quarries, and it gave Lord Penmaenmawr a name. His name was John Williams. He lived at Rhyd y Gro, and this enabled me to research a little bit of his history. He was quite an elderly man when the photograph was taken in 1874. He'd fled Llanllechid, I suspect with prudent haste, early in the 19th century, with a lady to whom he was not married at the time, and went to live in the cave of Adolam, otherwise known as Penmaenmawr. And when the photographer took a photograph of him, he said, "Well, my boy, you've made your fortune now." The low-tech nature of the industry can sometimes be very, very low indeed. Here are two of these slate makers' huts in the little Foyle quarry on the slopes of Moel Siabod. So you don't get industrial structures that are simpler than these, and this is where the men would sit to split the blocks with their hammer and chisel. Same sort of basic principle as the set makers' shelters you found in Penmaenmawr Quarry, with the one difference that they were often arranged in long rows. I've seen set makers' shelters in Penmaenmawr that are arranged in rows, but others are arranged individually and facing away from each other. I don't know whether that was to stop any scattered stone hitting another workman. After the splitting of the slate, the trimming of the edge, again, a process which has been mechanized, but which in many places remained as simple as this until the late 20th century, cutting them with a heavy knife, the cutlass fawr, the big knife. Now, mechanization of processing has left us some really very remarkable buildings. This splendid structure, built in 1855, 1856 in Cwm Stradfyn, was not unique, but very unusual in being a multi-floor slate mill. It was designed by an engineer appointed by the shareholders, who obviously had never designed a slate mill in his life before, didn't know how to do it, and he designed it on the same lines as an industrial workshop on the Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway at Miles Platting, and he left some hapless local technician to work out how to put the machinery in it. A view from the air, though, gives you some understanding of how this place functioned. You can see that it's been constructed on near a river to provide the water to power the machinery. You can see on the right of the photograph the course of the railway that connected the quarry to the sea at Penmaenmawr, and a siding entry into the mill for the raw blocks to be taken in and for the finished slabs to be taken out. So this is a splendid romantic ruin from the middle of the 19th century, but more common where these large industrial scale mills, such as this two-pile mill at Penmaenmawr quarry in Penmaenmawr, now looking rather the worse for wear. It was a skilled industry, as I'm sure you're all aware, but there was also a great deal of muscle power involved. Tipping the rock, which is 90%, tipping the waste rock, 90% or more of what's produced, basically just called for brawn, hard work. And this wonderful sketch by Mary Elizabeth Thompson from 1956 shows just what tipping that waste actually meant. Now, we tend to associate the British Industrial Revolution with steam power, and that, it seems to me, is only a very limited truth. The slate industry of Wales, North Wales in particular, was a great one for using water power. There's an argument in industry that you only actually use steam if you don't have enough water to turn machinery. And in North Wales, there's certainly plenty of water. Quarries, in many cases, had enormous gathering ground, and they made very sensible, very rational, very informed use of water. And it lasts a very long time as well. Now, this is a photograph taken in the early 50s, again of a little quarry on Moel Siabod, the Rhos quarry, which wasn't quite as high up as the Foel quarry I mentioned earlier, but was able to make use of mountain streams gathering off Siabod, and they installed a series of water wheels, of which this was the largest, and which powered the slate mill, which you see there in the background. Other uses of water were as a weight, and this splendid machine survives at Penrhyn Quarry, built towards the end of the 19th century. It's a shaft head frame in which the loads were raised by filling a tank in one of the shafts with water, and as soon as the weight of the water was greater than the load could be raised from the bottom of the pit, which you see there in the background, and brought to the surface. Now, 6 of these were still working until the modernization of the quarry in the mid-1960s, and when I was a very small child, I can't have been more than 6 or 7, I was actually given a ride in one of these things, and I date to that moment my interest in industrial archaeology. I think a view that sums up just how ingenious the use of water could be in the industry is this one of the Penmaenmawr quarry from about 1924. And you can see a whole sequence here of water wheels powering 3 sets of mills on different levels. So the one stream is made to do a very great deal of work. And that's actually not the only use of water you see here. I won't try and point it out to you, but you can, if you know where to look, you can see inclined planes, railways on a very steep gradient, which are also operated by water, and the same principle as the shaft I showed you earlier. So if you had the opportunity to use water, which is mainly free, you did so. If you couldn't, then of course there was the opportunity of using steam, but steam requires coal. Coal has to be brought in from South Wales or Lancashire or wherever it was, and it has to be transported inland. Now, key, I think, to our understanding of the slate industry is the fact that the major quarries were not very far away from navigable water. They were at most about 10 miles from a harbour. So that not only meant that overland export costs could be kept very, very low or comparatively low, it also meant that it was possible to have return traffic in machinery, coal, whatever else was necessary to keep a quarry going. And in the 20th century, the slate industry began to make use of electricity in a manner that I would describe as cautious but considered. They didn't go in for electrical machinery unless it had proved itself, but as soon as engineers in the quarries knew that this was a reasonably reliable form of power, they were adopted. And here's a view of an underground incline winding stage in one of the Penmaenmawr quarries. You may be able to see that to the right, the set of rails there you can see curving around drops down a significant gradient, and what you see in that platform is the motors that wound the drums that hauled the trucks up these inclines. So technically, it's a very interesting industry indeed, and an awful lot survives. Now, in terms also of what I would call landscape environment, I mean, this is perhaps the most striking aspect of the slate quarries of North Wales. And again, this is something that you can say of Penmaenmawr itself. You know, as you drive along the coast road, the impression you get is of a landscape, a quarrying environment, very, very dramatically changed by quarrying, by human intervention in the landscape. Now, the very common approach to slate quarrying, as I mentioned, is the use of the stepped gallery system. So you can see that very clearly here in this aerial view of Dinorwic quarry. But not only can you see the actual quarry face itself, but it gives you a very good impression of how the rock had to be dumped as expeditiously as possible. You didn't want to dump it, for instance, where there might be a good vein of slate rock. You can also see some very impressive inclined planes there to get the good rock down from the main working levels to the foot of the quarry. And what you can also see, and this is something I'll be coming back to in a minute, beyond the quarry there on the left, you can see the settlements that the slate industry brought into being. You can see the villages of Deiniolen and Cwtybont and the scattered cottager settlements around Dinorwic and Sardis. So that's a common type of environment, and very impressive it looks as well, best seen from the air, but you also get a wonderful view of Dinorwic quarry over Llanperis, on the road between Llanperis and Penmaenmawr. Now, the slate quarries of Nantlla, I think, do really have to be appreciated from the air, because these, of course, were pits on the valley floor or the valley sides, which created an acute problem if you were running a slate quarry. Where did you tip the rubble? Again, you had to make absolutely sure that you were not tipping this 90% or more waste rock where you were going to be quarrying in the future. So very many ingenious methods had to be devised for raising the slate blocks above the natural landform. And what this view also, I think, reinforces is the absolute importance of the nearness of these quarries to the sea. The Nantlla quarries are about 6 or 7 miles away from a good harbour in Carnarvon, another one at the Forrid, and if they'd been any further inland, their development would have been very significantly hindered. I don't think we would have had a slate industry in quite the same sort of way. And the environments of Penmaenmawr, well, on the surface, they are very impressive. If you drive over the Crimea Pass Road, or if you come on the Festiniog Railway up from Porthmadog, or if you drive up from Mount Turog, you see a very startling landscape indeed. But it's worth bearing in mind, of course, that when you look at these surface workings, these tips, you're only seeing a tiny proportion of what actually went on there. There are about 100 miles of tunnels underneath those surface workings, and these include some very powerful places indeed. Now, here's a view of one of the oldest workings in Penmaenmawr Quarry, with my friend Andrew Hurrell admiring the pillar of slate rock that he hopes is going to keep that roof up for another couple of 100 years. I've chosen this one because it actually is about the only place left I know where you can still see the oldest way of mining underground at Festiniog, from one vast chamber which is held up by pillars of rock. The later method of working was to create these honeycomb chambers, technology apparently based on limestone, underground limestone quarries in Dudley in the English West Midlands. But it's a sobering thing to think that there are thousands of these chambers underground in Gwyn Festiniog, 100 miles or so, as I say, of tunnels, and very many artifacts, rails, machinery, a caban, I've seen men's coats and shoes still surviving there. Aberllefenni Quarry in southern Gwynedd, mainly an underground working, but on a completely different pattern. The chambers here are near vertical. They're slightly, about 10 degrees inclined off the vertical, and some of them are hundreds of feet high. Some of them you enter from the gloom of the access tunnel, and you see this light filtering down from the surface. So although you have many different underground environments, they are not the same. Geology meant that they had to be worked in very different ways. Survival of features, as I say, can be quite remarkable underground. This is a view of, it's not actually a mine, it's one of the access tunnels at Penryn Slate Quarry, and this is where I was allowed to go exploring when I was 6 years old in 1963, and I was allowed to go exploring there a couple of years back. It hadn't changed. Nothing had changed. It had just been left like Tutankhamun's tomb. Some quite impressive pieces of machinery as well, like this gigantic Glasgow-built crane underground in Aberllefenni Quarry, and other features such as this staircase at Cwmorthyn, a mine which is now open to the public, and I think gives you much the best chance to understand what it was like to work as a 19th century slate quarryman. When I say open to the public, you can't just walk in, but it is operated by a chap called Miles Moulding, and the organisation is called Go Below. So if any of you are of an adventurer's bent, I do recommend that you find out about what Go Below can offer. And it's a remarkable thing to think as well, of course, that all of these tunnels, all of these chambers had railway systems. Again, some of these remain more or less intact. This is a view of one at Llachwedd Mine, an abandoned part of Llachwedd Mine. And when you travel on the Festiniog Railway, as I hope you all will do as soon as restrictions permit, it's an extraordinary thing to think that this railway, 13.5 miles long, if you count all the extensions, the privately owned extensions into the quarries, all the way to the rock face, then that was probably a network of about 250 miles of actual track. Not of route miles, but of actual track. Now, nobody, of course, would ever take a train from the rock face all the way to the harbour at Porthmadog, but it was one of the largest interconnected narrow gauge railway systems in the world. So that's work, that's technology, that's environment. What about the other things that survive? What about how people lived? Now, North Wales, Northwest Wales, by the end of the 18th century, was not a densely populated area. You had the tiny cathedral town of Bangor. You had the only slightly larger borough town of Carnarvon, Tywyn down south, a couple of other towns that had really almost ceased to be. There were no existing centres of population where slate quarries were to be opened. So this meant the creation of completely new settlements. Now, just as I think you have quite a wide variety of environment in terms of the actual quarrying landscape, so you have an interesting variety of dwellings, villages, and towns associated with this industry. Again, I'm minded to introduce the comparison of Penmaenmawr. Penmaenmawr was very centred. Penmaenmawr actually produced a building, a wall building material. The slate industry produced a roofing material. That's quite different. Much of the earliest housing for quarrymen were in the form of these scattered cottage buildings from the very late 18th century. This is a wonderfully preserved example of actually two cottages, Tynllwyn, near Rhosgadfan. And the rule seems to have been that there was no rule. If you wanted to work in the quarry, you had nowhere to live, then you just marked out a bit of territory for yourself under that ancient tradition whereby it all seems to have involved throwing axe heads as far as you could go and having a fire lit in the morning. This is what made places like Rhosgadfan, Rhostryfan, Clutterbont, Dinorwig, plenty of other locations. And the magistrates and other local bigwigs said, yeah, just let them get on with it. We need people to move into these quarries. We need men to work in the quarries. So they're not doing anybody any harm, quite the contrary. You do also get housing that's very much still in the cottage tradition, a small dwelling, a bit of land associated with it, but that never was a free-for-all. This is a view of Mynydd Llandigai, Penrhyn Quarry in the background, but you can see here that the cottages and their gardens are all laid out very, very carefully indeed. The Penrhyn estate said, right, we're going to divide this mountain waste up into accommodation for our quarrymen. We are going to provide them with a house, and we're going to provide them with a field, and we are basically going to make sure that they don't become a landless industrial proletariat. They are going to be, if you like, peasant farmer quarrymen. That was the idea. Didn't always work. They tried the same idea at Cwm Stradllen. There's Gorsedda Quarry in the background, and can you see in the foreground that 3 streets and some houses, 36 houses in fact, all now in ruin, have been laid out on the hillside. Now, this was the same organisation that built that big 3-storey slate mill, and they made the same mistake here. They got a map, they drew some ruled lines on the hillside and said, right, that's where the village is going to be. They didn't ask anyone if it was a good place to build houses, and it most certainly was not. You can't even grow potatoes there, and the streams running through it were almost designed to give people cholera, which is what happened. Of course, none of this would have happened without capital, very major capital investment, symbolised for me by Penrhyn Castle. Wealth the Penrhyn family could command was vastly in excess of what other entrepreneurs were able to offer. And that's why Penryn Quarry develops earlier than the others, and arguably why it's still in existence now. And the other end of the valley is, of course, the village of Bethesda. There is the quarry. But the interesting thing is that where there was a tiny little bit of land that didn't belong to Lord Penryn, that's where most of the quarrymen chose to build the village. Some of them, yes, they lived the other side of the valley in Mynydllantygai, but here was a little strip of land that wasn't his property. That's where the village was built. So they were effectively saying, yeah, we'll work in your quarry, but we'll work in it on our own terms, and we won't live on your land. Some surprising little settlements, the village of Rhywbach, this is it, in Penmaenmawr, which had a school, a row of houses, some cottage dwellings, a shop, a corrugated iron school, and that, well, I won't say it flourished, but it certainly lasted until the 1930s, and its ruins are there to see. The most distinctly urban of the quarry communities, as suggested by Festiniog. Here's a wonderful view from the 1870s showing the town pretty much under construction. There was hardly anything there even into the 1860s. By the 1880s, with a boom in the slate industry, it had become a proper thoroughgoing industrial town with big planned urban squares, huge chapels, church, cafes, all the trappings of urban life. And look, it's all still there. One of the most remarkable houses in Festiniog is this one, to Ryncorn, the one chimney house, which gave its name to the street on which it stands, Runcorn Street. Somebody didn't understand that Ryncorn meant one chimney, and they thought it was a reference to the town of Runcorn. Well, it's not, but this is the first industrial house, or that is to say, the first house built for quarrying families in Festiniog. 4 houses in the one building, all sharing a hearth and this central chimney. An adaptation of actually a gentry design for housing, but for the benefit of slate quarrying families. And whenever I'm taking American visitors around Festiniog, I always show them this place, and I always tell them that the first child born in Ryncorn emigrated to America, served in the Union Army, and died as a prisoner of the Confederate Army in Andersonville Prison, the notorious Confederate prison. Always sends a shiver up their spine. But in Blaenau, you can see the evolution of this, if you like, semi-rural type of settlement. You know, this is a row of houses, but it's basically a row of cottages, individually designed cottages from the 1840s or so, to these very, if you like, Coronation Street type houses that were erected at the end of the 19th century. The big difference here, of course, as you can see, is that, yes, of course, it's got a slate roof. Of course, it's built out of local stone, but it's also making use of imported brick. One thing you can tell throughout North Wales is houses that were built before the railways came and houses that were built after the railways came. And this is very much an after the railways row of houses. Well, here's a view of transport before the railways. Very few views, sadly, paintings or sketches or whatever, showing the transport of slate before the building of the railway systems. But here's a splendid one from the National Library of Wales, showing a slate cart making its way down the slope from Llanfestiniog towards the floor of the Dwyrid Valley. And you can see this is a 2-axle cart. How exactly those poor horses aren't being knocked out of the way by the weight of the cart itself, I don't know. But this was how Festiniog slate was initially exported, not to Porthmadog by road necessarily, but to a whole series of little quays along the Dwyrid River. Then, of course, you get the building of the the railway systems. The first one, not surprisingly, connects Penryn Quarry with the sea, and that's built in 1801. I say not surprisingly, because railways are capital intensive, and Lord Penryn, Richard Pennant, was the man who had the money to build such a system. It's another 24 years before the next one is built, and that's the one that connects Dinorwic Quarry with the sea at Aberlin-Helly. The Festiniog Railway, well, the Nantlle Railway in 1828, and the Festiniog Railway is opened in 1836. Here's a view of the Festiniog Railway in the 1840s, showing a run of wagons that's just arrived at Boston Lodge and is about to be hauled over the Cobb to the harbour at Porthmadog. The Festiniog Railway made history in the 1860s and the 1870s by the introduction of steam locomotives and by adopting passenger carriage, basically turning this mineral railway into a small but fully fledged railway. You know, it was, if you like, a 2-foot gauge version of what you might have seen at Euston or Preston or somewhere like that. A modern contemporary railway, and the idea was that railways of this sort could be adopted throughout the British Empire, as indeed they were. What we don't have much of any longer is evidence for the shipping trade. Now, as I'm sure you're all aware, much of the shipping was in local hands. It was locally crewed very often, and these little ships literally went all over the world. You might find a crew of a handful of men, a couple of boys, setting off in one of these little 2-masters from Bangor or Felinheli, Carnarvon, Porthmadog, Aberdyfi, to go to Melbourne or Pernambuco or wherever it might be. And there's been a lot of work done recently to identify wrecks, what was left of these ships. This is one actually not far from Porthmadog, but there's a remarkable population of identified Porthmadog wrecks just off the coast of Schleswig-Holstein, obviously on their way to Hamburg. Well, I was asked not to speak for much longer than 3/4 of an hour, so I've tried to keep this fairly concise. I'm going to end again with William Williams, because he, for me, sums up, if you like, the skilled Welsh quarrymen, the individuals who put work, back-breaking toil into creating this industry, and who suffered this extraordinary sense of bewilderment when it all seemed to be about to disappear very quickly in the late 1960s. The industry had been declining for about 60 years already by then, but it was still a tremendous blow to people, as you can imagine, when these giants of the industry seemed to be about to vanish. There's so much more I could talk about, ladies and gentlemen. I could talk to you about the UNESCO bid for World Heritage status for the industry. There are so many points of detail I could have explored further. But I hope that's given you some sense of where we are with the slate industry of North Wales. It was a remarkable industry. It wasn't a big one, but it had a global impact, and it completely refashioned and remade the culture, the landscape, and the environment of North Wales. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you. Very interesting, and we'll have to invite you back another day to tell us more about this interesting landscape. I haven't got any questions in the chat box at the moment. Does anybody have any questions they'd like to ask David? If you'd prefer, you can. Oh, here's one. Here's one. Oh yeah, no. I haven't got anything here yet. If you'd like to unmute yourself and you'd prefer to ask David a question.
A question, please.
Yes, Seema.
Hello. Yes, Seema.
Hi.
Hi. Thanks very much for the talk. It's absolutely fascinating. I wanted to know maybe if you knew where the coal had come from for the steam part of the railway, whether it had come from the Mostyn colliery at all, or if the iron for the actual tracks for the railway had come from that area of Flintshire. Is that something that you would know anything about, or?
By and large, coal came from South Wales because that was where the best steam coal was. I mean, people tend to think that coal was this sort of rather amorphous pile of black lumps, and in fact, coal is a very varied sort of thing. You had particular types of coal for steam making in boilers. You had a different type of coal for a domestic hearth. You'd have a different type of coal again in a smithy. So I don't think the Flintshire area was particularly apt to supply the slate industry. In terms of where iron comes from, we do have details of, for instance, where the earliest iron rails used on the railway systems came from: the Black Country, northeast of England, South Wales. I mean, Dowlais Ironworks and the other South Wales ironworks actually supplied rails for probably most of the railways built in the United States, Europe, and the United Kingdom until about the middle of the 19th century. The Festiniog Railway, for instance, got its first set of rails from Dowlais. The Nantlle Railway got its rails from Northumberland, from Ledlington Ironworks. But then, of course, it all goes over to steel, and that's Sheffield then.
But the Besham Ironworks with John Wilkinson, was that at all linked, or is that not again another?
Plasgrono Ironworks, which is part of that Wrexham group of ironworks, supplied rails to Dinorwic Quarry in 1824. So there was some connection with the Wrexham area. I've never come across Bersham. I mean, I can't think off the top of my head of Bersham supplying a Welsh quarry.
I'm just thinking more of kind of local supply. If North Wales had some of these resources that would have been possibly used as for access, ease of access, as it was kind of in the area,
Anglesey coal
Wales, so.
is only good really for lime kilns and gasworks.
Right.
So I've never heard of that being used. Iron ore, I mean, there is iron ore, of course, in North Wales, but it would have been sent somewhere else for smelting. And once you move into steel, there was never a steelworks in Northwest Wales. You do, of course, have steelworks in the Wrexham area later on. But there was also never a rolling mill in North Wales. I don't think there were, for wrought iron, I don't think there were rolling mills anywhere other than the West Country and South Wales. I mean, as much as possible, the industry did resource what it could from the area. So, for instance, you have the De Winton Ironworks at Carnarvon, which was astonishingly versatile. It turned out machinery for the Penmaenmawr quarries, turned out machinery for the slate industry, and big ships for the Odessa grain trade, which might be built at Birkenhead, would then be sailed to Carnarvon to have De Wintons put their engines in. So it was an area as a whole with considerable technical resources. It had a lot, but I would say it didn't have everything.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Seema. Thank you. I don't have any other questions in the chat box. Does anybody want to ask David something from
David, it's Chris here. If you click on your chat box, there might be a couple of questions I sent through to you there.
Oh, right, okay. Now, I'm not sure. How do I do this?
There's just a little box at the bottom of the screen after participants and before share screen. in the middle there.
Chat, is that the one?
Yes, that's the
Yeah.
one.
Aha, right, okay. So there we go. So, where shall I start? Shall I deal with the issue of accidents and death rates?
Yeah.
Because that's one question, and it's one that is constantly asked, of course. What were accidents and death rates like? Well, the answer is, in the 19th century, of course, they were very high indeed. And this has often been explained, if that's the right word, by managerial indifference. What it seems to me was the case until, say, the end of the 19th century, and I wouldn't like to put a date on it, is that quarrymen regarded themselves as independent workers and as people who were responsible for their own health and safety, and would actually have resented as a managerial intrusion what they would have seen as inappropriate preaching to them about health and safety. It seems an extraordinary thing to say, but one of the things that the quarrymen at Penryn resented in the 1890s, just before the Great Strike, was this evidently loathsome under-manager, H.P. Mears, trying to introduce first aid classes for them. You know, they felt, well, that's not your job. You know, we look after ourselves, thank you very much. And besides, we're all good Methodists. So whenever God wants us, God will take us, thank you very much. And we won't live in Bethesda any longer, we'll live in heaven. So, you know, you've got to make a bit of a leap here into a mindset that has now become quite alien to us.
Indeed.
Another, just before I leave this, I mean, I'm not for one moment making light of the way that people got killed or hurt in the industry, but far more dangerous, would you believe it, if a government report of 1896 is to be believed, the Merchant Navy, working as a shunter on the railways, and believe it or not, working as a hairdresser.
Mm-hmm.
You say, why hairdresser? I can only assume it was the dyes that were being used and the other chemicals. But apparently working as a hairdresser was an absolutely lethal industry.
I've got another question. David, I've got a question coming here. Why did the slate industry decline? Was it lack of raw materials or the declining market?
Declining market
That was
primarily.
from Jeffrey Rowlett.
Oh, right. Oh, well, Jeff. First of all, of course, a slate roof has got good built-in obsolescence. It's going to be there in 100 years' time. It could be there in 200 years' time. So once the building boom was over, you didn't really need to replace it, and there wasn't the demand for buildings. By the 1920s, of course, you have the vogue for flat roof buildings. In the British climate, they're a very bad idea, but that's what people wanted in the 20s and the 30s. And there was also cheaper slate coming in from America and France. So, and tiles, the tile industry picked itself up in the 20th century. So several reasons.
Okay. And you mentioned, this is from Anna, you mentioned being able to date houses to before and after the railways came into being. Is this due mostly to the presence of brick in the visible architecture? Not in the bread ovens, which you see a lot in older houses?
Well, I have a theory, which may be completely wrong, that there are actually several ways in which you can date a house. I mean, obviously the railway arrives in different places, in different communities. But for instance, older Welsh houses of the 19th century have small windows. Is this because getting glass in from, where do you make glass? It's gone straight out of my head. Lancashire, Pilkingtons.
Pilkingtons, yes.
Pilkingtons. Is that because glass is expensive because you have to transport it? Probably. Is it also got something to do with the fact, this may be completely wrong, but it is, my idea, is it related to the fact that people are now burning coal in their grates rather than peat? In other words, peat which you dig off the mountainside, and then coal which you buy from a coal merchant in the railway station. Brick is another one. Also, the change in roof timbers from locally grown oak to imported pine, Scandinavian pine, and then increasingly New World, Canadian or United States pine. So there's a whole, I think, discussion that needs to happen here, and people who are interested in traditional housing and how these places actually got built and where the materials came from.
Okay, just another couple here, David. Is Wales investing in the conservation of these industrial sites? That's from Anya.
Well, that's a very good question. Now, I purposely didn't say much about the World Heritage bid because that's another talk in its entirety. But the answer is yes, insofar as that's practical. Say take a quarry like Dinorwic Quarry, where you probably got about 50 weighbridge houses. Just to take one type of building at random, how do you conserve? Which ones do you conserve, or do you not conserve them? Do you target particularly important structures? And do you face the fact that these are going to fall to bits again in the years to come? So quite difficult questions have to be asked there about whether one can repurpose structures within slate quarries, but the answer is yes. The Welsh Government through Cadw is investing in conservation of some of the more important features. Okay. I noticed, by the way, somebody has pointed out, of course, it's St Helens, the town where glass is produced. So
yes,
thanks for that.
Yes. And just one about the miners who worked in the slate quarry. Did they have much training, or did they just have to go in and learn on the job?
Well, you learned in the old days with your father or your uncle or your older brother. And because these men considered themselves independent workers, you didn't need to negotiate with the boss if you felt that your son was old enough to help you out. And I suspect that was what typically would have happened, say in the very early 19th century. Dad would think, well, the boy's too old to go to school, or there isn't a school. He'll come with me to the quarry. He can play with his mates, so long as he doesn't get in the way. And then after a couple of years, I'll say to him, oh, come on, give me a hand with this, or do you want to see how Dad splits slate? And so it went on. Apprenticeship schemes seem only to have been introduced in the very early 20th century, and again were resented. This was another reason, I think, why the Penrhyn quarrymen in particular were enraged at the way they were being treated at the end of the 19th century.
Thank you. And a question about the production of slates in other parts of the UK. What percentage of the slate came from Northwest Wales?
About 2/3.
2/3. There, that was lovely. And a very quick one, you mentioned the Uncorn House in Blaenau. Where is it exactly? I cannot for the life of me place it, says Rebecca.
Right, where is it? Okay, if you're standing outside the public loos in Blaenau Ffestiniog, the old railway station, and you're facing the quarry incline, carry on walking in that direction, turn left when you get to the end of the car park, carry on up the hill a little way, and it's on your left-hand side. It's right underneath the actual Blaenau of the parish. So that's probably as good as it's going to get by a purely verbal description this evening.
Okay.
I can give you a grid reference if you want, but that's where it is.
And this is just a little observation from Megan Roberts about in 1999, she was working in Sydney when it was hit by a monster hailstorm, which has been categorised as Australia's third worst natural disaster. One of the consequences were that roofs were punctured by the hailstones. A couple of weeks later, my father, who lived in Llangefni, sent me an article from the Chronicle celebrating the fact that one of the biggest orders in modern times had been placed by the Australians to repair their roofs.
Well, sensible Australians, I say. There are some wonderful Welsh slate roofs in Australia, and I was very well. I mean, this is the sort of person I am. I was fascinated to come across an article by a chap called Miles Lewis on the history of building materials in Australia, which has a section entirely devoted to slate. And not only do you have, obviously, the exhibition hall at Melbourne, plenty of other Welsh slate roofs there, even to the extent that they sent out complete houses made of slate to Australia in kit form. So these were slate slabs that had been sawn to make a house, and they were flat pack houses, basically. They were sent out in these wooden schooners, and they were screwed together in Australia. Didn't last long,
No.
but it seemed like a good idea at the time.
And there's two other questions here that might be, you might feel it's another lecture in itself. What do you feel is the slate industry's legacy on the local culture of North West Wales?
Well, that's an excellent question. I would go so far as to say that the Welsh language would barely have survived if it had not been for the slate industry. Now, it was the only significant British industry, I'm going to chance this, that was conducted in a language other than English pretty much throughout its history. The coal mines of South Wales were largely English language by the 20th century. I know there are plenty of exceptions to that. The anthracite collieries of the Western coalfield, for instance, remained Welsh in speech, well, probably until the end of the industry. But what the slate industry gave the rural population of North Wales, it seems to me, was good money, a job, a skilled job that you could take pride in. So people did not have to leave the farms to go and work in, an English colliery or an English ironworks, whatever it might be. Wasn't the same experience that people in Ireland had. You didn't have to have seasonal migration of labour. You could stay, if not at home, at least within, say, 10 or 15 miles of where you've been brought up. You might have been born in Llyn or Hiraethog, but you could get a job with other people speaking your language, worshipping in the same way as you, same outlook as you in Bethesda or Blaenau-Ffestiniog or Llanberis. So I think that this particular industry pretty much saved the Welsh language.
And the the strike that was had at Pennant, I got a question on that just then, and I've lost it now. I don't know if you've got it.
How damaging was to the industry was the Penmaenmawr strike?
Yeah.
Yeah, the short answer to that is I don't know, and I don't think anybody's ever worked it out. Demand was already falling by 1898. 1898 was the end of the last significant boom. Now, it's interesting that at Penrhyn Quarry, trouble always began when a boom was coming to an end. So that happened in 1866. It happened in the 1870s, and it happened in 1898. So I'm sure it's a factor, but how and in what way? What nobody has ever done is actually examine the economics, well, of the industry. I mean, I don't understand economics, I'm the first to admit, but nobody has really tried looking at the actual day-to-day economics of running Penryn Quarry. And you could argue, supposing one were really being devil's advocate, one could say that the strike probably made life easier for the management of Penryn Quarry because they got rid of a lot of men that they couldn't keep on.
Yeah. And similarly, sorry, David, I interrupted you there.
No, you go on.
Okay. The Penryn or the Pennants have been marked out as villains in the history of Slate, and particularly Bethesda. Do you recognise that the Pennants had a major influence on the economy of North Wales?
Absolutely.
Northwest Wales.
Yeah. I think there's no getting away from it. I mean, it is, it's difficult, isn't it? These people were slave owners on a massive scale. They ran a quarry that had a poor history of labour relations. And so there are, if you like, items to their discredit in the historical record. The irony, it's a very bitter irony, but it's, I think, undeniable, and it affects all of us, is that without their capital, this industry that created this very dynamic Welsh language culture couldn't have come into being.
And on the subject of the economy, in its heyday, how much did the slate industry contribute towards the economy of Wales and the UK?
Well, that's something that's never been calculated and would, I think, take a very able economist even to venture that. I mean, let's put it like this. You've got, by the end of the 19th century, 16,000 men who are earning between £1 and £2, maybe £2.10 a week all over North Wales. You'd be earning 10 bob a week on a farm. So it's putting a lot of money into local circulation. It's also providing employment for the whole service bourgeoisie associated with them. Dentists, doctors, ministers of religion, school teachers. So that would have been quite a considerable benefit to the economy. And just think of those 13 million terraced houses.
Yeah, absolutely. David, thank you.